Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the Filmmakers Collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. Returning guest Brandon Katz joins me on this episode to take a look at some compelling data that's informing several film and television-related stories he's recently published. As the Director of Insight and Content Strategy for Greenlight Analytics, Brandon, who's also a former entertainment journalist and film critic, unpacks data analysis to reveal compelling trends within the film and media industry. In our chat, we discussed how multi-year film development cycles can often result in films whose cultural relevance may fade between the time a project is greenlit to the time it hits the movie screens. While the film's subject matter and stars may still be compelling, audience interest may have drifted. We also chatted about Netflix's recent decision to scale back on the number of original films it rolls out on its streaming service. And finally, we talk about the emphasis on opening weekend box office numbers and how they may undermine the chances for smaller films to find an audience and grow over time. Brandon's knowledge of and love for movies, combined with his data analyst's eye for the stories to be found within the numbers, always makes for a compelling conversation. Making Media Now is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum. From providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs, Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. And please be sure to hit the like and follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast, which can now be found on YouTube. Now on to my conversation with Brandon Katz. Brandon Katz, welcome to Making Media Now.
Thank you so much for having me back on, Michael. I feel like such an honored return guest. I really appreciate it.
Well, if I look at the roster rundown, I think you might be the most returned guest. That sounds like we took you back. No, the leader in the returning guest category.
I'm so grateful, and if I'm not, then I want to pad my stats to make sure my lead is safe.
We'll do that. Maybe we'll just run this one twice back to back. It'll be a twofer. But I feel like this should almost count for a twofer because there's such a rich store of current content that you've been producing that I want to talk about. So your current role is Director of Insights and Content Strategy for an organization called Greenlight Analytics. But give us the sort of thumbnail sketch of the Brandon Katz story and how you got to that position and what you do in that role as Director of Insights and Content Strategy at Greenlight Analytics, besides write very compelling content, articles in various publications, really around the data of what's happening out there in the media landscape.
Well, Michael, you're altruistic with your praise, but I like it. I remember I was 15 years old. My dad sat me down and said, "Son, it's great that you love movies and TV so much, but you can't make a living out of that." And I said, "Watch me." And so I graduated college. I spent 8 years as a full-time entertainment industry reporter and film and TV critic. But as a reporter, I was constantly covering the X's and O's behind the business strategy of Hollywood, the levers that actually made the financial industry run. And I absolutely loved it. I was covering the early streaming ratings as the streaming boom was just taking off. And I realized that I wanted to get more involved on that side of the equation. So 5-6 years ago, I kind of transitioned to the analyst consulting side of things. I was with Parrot Analytics before. Now I'm with Greenlight Analytics. And in my role, I spend about 50% of my job using our data and our industry insights to help strategically guide clients. That could be a production company, a major streaming service, a major film studio, all across the spectrum with different questions, different goals. We use our data and audience intelligence to help them accomplish those goals. And the other 50% of my job, which you just kind of mentioned, using that data to tell really interesting public-facing narratives that help answer frequently asked questions and challenges facing the industry. And as we all know, anyone paying attention to film and TV and the entertainment media industry at large, there's a lot of challenges and obstacles, Michael. It is a tough time out there. So if we can help make it a little bit easier, we will.
Absolutely. So, your love of movies, when you were reminding me in a previous conversation that you and I had, you kind of told me that story. And
Have I
I
been
love,
reusing material? Uh-oh.
well, no, we all do, which is great because it's succinct and it's correct. It's apt. But no, basically you threaded the needle so perfectly in the sense that you found a way to make a living taking a deep dive into something that you love, and that was movies. What I was curious about was I'm going to guess that your love of movies derived from the making of the movies, the stories that were being told in the movies. So it's almost like a left brain, right brain kind of a thing. And now your work is almost like you lift the hood on the movies and not just how they're made and the data around what allowed them to be made, but also the filmmakers and the studio's sense of what the market is. I guess what I'm asking is, does your exposure to the numbers game, does it disenchant you at all from the magic that the movies either had or have on you?
Fantastic question, Michael. That's something no one's ever asked me, and I love it. And the honest to God answer is absolutely not. It has augmented, increased, benefited my love of movie magic because now I know the strategy behind something that really works. And I'm like, my God, was that marketing strategy, a cut above what you see? Or man, did they really reverse engineer the perfect thematic narrative and audience segmentation for the perfect time? And they grafted it onto a hell of a story. And now, not to toot my own horn, but I do think that my clients have always kind of had good feedback for me in that I am a former critic with a love of the creative and
Sure.
I know the numbers. So I have been able to offer both support on the creative and business strategy side. So I can give you notes on your script, but then attach it to the data backed reasons why this is strategically beneficial for you to do X, Y, Z. And giving me that 360 view of the industry has been so enriching personally and only makes me love film, TV, media even more.
Yeah, you're definitely merging the head and the heart. You're kind of the Billy Bean of the movie industry.
Well, that is just an insult to Billy Bean, but I'll take
No, no, it isn't. Not at all. It's a compliment to both of you. So you had an article. I printed it out, and I can't really see the publication that it came from. But the headline was "Box Office Behavior: Hollywood Can't Keep Up with Culture."
it. Yes.
And you start off using three films that I think were released somewhere in the 2022 to 2024 window. Damien Chazelle's Babylon, Scorsese's Killer of the Flower Moon, and Alexander Payne's The Holdovers. What did those three films have in common that you wanted to use them as kind of the templates for the story you wanted to tell in that article?
Yeah, so box office behavior is actually an every 4 to 6 weeks white paper essay series that I produce for Greenlight Analytics, my company. So you can check those out at greenlightanalytics.com.
Right
Shameless
on.
plug.
Yeah, that should be
And
some must reading for people who are interested in the head and the heart of the film industry.
there we go. And so I use those three films as a microcosm for my larger thesis in that essay because those three films were. And now Babylon was a bit critically divisive, but considered extrememely ambitious and almost Wolf of Wall Street 2.0. So there was a lot to like there. Killers of the Flower Moon and The Holdovers were both critically acclaimed. Both had various Oscars nominations. And yet all three films, relative to their budget,
Yep.
struggled at the box office. Now, why is that if they have at the ground floor the elements we associate with good movies? They have genres that
And I
are
think that,
popular.
and they also have stars. I mean,
Oh yeah,
particularly, Babylon was Brad Pitt
and Margot
and,
Robbie.
and, and Margot Robbie, and, Killers of the Flower Moon is DiCaprio and De Niro.
Exactly. So it got me thinking, well, how come some films that on paper seem to check all the boxes tend to struggle or not connect when quality is there for the most part? And I started to really realize that the development cycle of Hollywood is just simply moving too slow for a fragmented, attention span challenged, social media driven pop culture bubble these days. Because your average film, now everything is different, but there's an adage in Hollywood there is no such thing as a fast deal in Hollywood. So your average film from inception and Greenlight to actual release on theaters can take between 3 and 5 years. So the assumptions that went into that Greenlight of, hey, I think this will connect with audiences for XYZ may be completely out of date by the time it actually reaches audiences. So, how do we as an industry solve for that problem? How do we almost create an interstellar ish wormhole that shrinks the distance between concept, development, greenlight, and releasing in a audience aligned, financially feasible landscape?
Yeah, and so when you talk about kind of the, perhaps on the day a film was greenlit, right? It's going to be, say, that 3 to 5 years before that film hits theaters and audiences are going to be viewing it. And you mentioned in the article kind of maybe a culture shift, like an aspect of the culture that may have existed on the day the film was greenlit doesn't really exist or doesn't exist in large enough numbers, when the film is out into theaters. Help me pick apart that notion of the culture shift. Is it literally an appetite for that type of storytelling? Is it the buzz that a particular filmmaker might have? In the case of Babylon, Damien Chazelle had just come off of La La Land, did that win the Oscar? I think it did, right?
It lost to Moonlight in that epic
Oh, that's right.
mistake.
Exactly. I
Though I
turned it off.
personally love
I
both of
turned
them.
the broadcast off when Michael Douglas said that it was La La Land. So, in my mind, no, that's right. That
Exactly.
was that was the major screw up. But point being, yeah, what constitutes what the cultural vibe was from point A to point B?
Fantastic question, Michael. I yet again am reminded why you do this for a living, because you really do ask great questions. And I think Killers of the Flower Moon is perhaps the clearest example of what I'm talking about. That was a film that was punishing. It was a 3.5, and I'm saying that as someone who's a huge fan. It's a 3.5 hour historical epic about America's disgusting historical relationship in terms of the treatment of Native American people and the murderous history
Right.
on our part. It is a beautiful, important film, but it is punishing and difficult. And in a post-COVID world, we realized very quickly in box office trends and TV trends all reflect this. People were looking for fantastical escapism. There was a massive rise in genre entertainment post-COVID. You're talking about fantasy, superhero, sci-fi. There was a turn towards feel good entertainment. I think Ted Lasso is an incredible microcosm of that. And so something like Killers of the Flower Moon, which had all these stars and had this prestige pedigree, just wasn't necessarily what people wanted to flock to. Now, again, it made $200+ million, but relative to its budget,
Yeah.
it was unfortunately a theatrical failure. It did quite well on Apple TV Plus, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of positives you can say, but it was clear that the cultural appetite for a challenging epic was just not there. People coming out of COVID wanted something more upbeat, more uplifting, and something that pointed towards better days, not reminded them of challenges and tragedy.
Taking that into consideration, I'm thinking of a couple of releases over the past 12 to 18 months or so, particularly Eddington, and say One Battle After Another. Now, Eddington couldn't have been more in the COVID moment. It's a movie about tribalism and disinformation. COVID plays a huge role. I'm imagining the development on that had to be relatively quick because this couldn't have been. Was it pitched during COVID? And I don't know if it's considered a box office success or not, but it certainly didn't feel like a failure.
I can't speak to when that movie went into development. I do know Ari Aster, I believe, who's the director. It does run a tight ship and is pretty darn efficient. It wasn't
Interesting.
necessarily a huge box office success, but I think, again, it was a reminder of things that people kind of wanted to leave in the past. Now, I have not personally seen that movie. I know Ari Aster is incredibly talented. It's
Oh,
on
okay.
my ever expanding list to catch up. But I think what ultimately my piece tries to get at is the idea of Yes, film should be made with universal, timeless themes,
Yep.
in which case they can be released anytime and success. But it really helps to track attitudinal and behavioral consumer sentiments and patterns to be able to better project where things are heading. So, a great example of that, something we know for a fact at Greenlight Analytics because of years of consumer first party data, is that anxieties and attention around the economy and a household's financial situation spike every time in an election year, like clockwork. So knowing that, you can kind of, I'm not saying the data is going to write a movie for you, but you can tailor a script's themes around that and have a better idea of the optimal release window to connect with what is on people's mind. And that is just one of a million different examples that understanding where people are thinking politically, socially, economically, looking at these kind of socio-cultural alignment, the talent that's involved, looking at underserved audiences that for some reason Hollywood just doesn't program enough for. When you take all of those different variables and you start tracking them over time, you start to see patterns and better projections into the future of what is going to be the table sending cultural agenda.
What is your sense from within Hollywood as to the validity of this phenomenon that you're uncovering? Is there an internal agreement that we really do need to tighten these development windows? And what would you say are the biggest factors that are preventing the tightening of those windows?
Listen, Hollywood as of right now is not equipped to look further into the future in order to plan this more strategically. And we view this as kind of a slate optimization tool, and we're building something for it. Now, having said that, this is not the first time anyone has ever thought of this idea. Nobody has a crystal ball. No approach is foolproof. But
Sure.
Hollywood absolutely knows it needs to be able to cut down on the production time and for better and for worse, AI is factoring into that conversation in a million different ways. But they also know that they need to create new lenses and frameworks with which to view the data that is at hand to better assist them in plotting out 18, 24, 36 months in advance to make sure that they are staying at the crest of the wave of the cultural conversation.
So outside of the genre of films that you mentioned, the genre type films that you mentioned, I would say that Babylon, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Holdovers, they don't have anything in common, sort of from a plot standpoint or tonally or anything like that, other than two of the three have huge stars. And I guess, if you're a big Paul Giamatti fan, you could say three of the three
Right.
do, right? But The Holdovers felt like it could have been made in the 1980s. I mean, it even had that film stock look of
Oh,
of
yeah.
a film that was made in that period. I could see that running as a double feature with Dead Poets Society, or something of that nature. So,
I think you just planned my Friday night, Michael. Thank you.
okay, there you go.
I think you should take a ticket admission cut.
Get that popcorn popping. So in your article, you talk about the need for better prescriptions for an audience pulse check. What would that look like to be able to say that, you know what, there is an audience for The Holdovers, there is an audience for Babylon, in films of that nature?
So, in the case of The Holdovers, I think you really nailed it. That is a movie that you kind of feel like comes out of the 1980s or the 1990s. And zooming out, the kind of pre-IP era of Hollywood, in which original and new to screen, adult driven, dramedies without special effects kind of ruled the roost. People forget that Rain Man led the box office in its release year, which sounds crazy to say
Sure.
these days. And unfortunately, the theatrical marketplace has more or less, and definitely leaning towards more, moved away from that model. And you can also see that kind of reflected in the data. So when we look at home streaming data, we see multi-platform streamers, people who subscribe to more than one platform. The vast majority are older consumers in the US. When we look at streaming cutters, households that have reduced the number of streaming subscriptions, we're actually seeing younger consumers cut out more. So what does that tell you? It means the older audience has largely shifted to streaming. And we
Mhm.
also know from a different data source, those two were Greenlight Analytics, this one is Samba TV, that older audiences are the most loyal, high retention subscribers in streaming in the US. So all of those data points paint a very clear picture of a large swath of older skewing consumers that are highly engaged in streaming, are highly loyal to streaming, and reflect a perception of I prefer to wait until this is available at home. And
Sure.
so when you're making something like The Holdovers that is geared more towards that audience, even though I loved it as a barely sub 35 audience member, it paints a picture of financial viability.
Financial viability for the studios and for the producers of the films, but also I do wonder the role of economics on the part of those younger audiences because it feels like, every 6 to 12 months, the streamers are all increasing their rates. And if you want to have a comprehensive, streaming menu in your home, you're looking at, you're dropping multiples of $100 a month sometimes to keep up with all of them.
Yeah, consumers, particularly younger consumers, have finally reached cost consciousness at a significant level in which price elasticity is starting to really take effect after all these price hikes. We know that younger consumers will burn and churn significantly more than those older consumers. So they'll watch whatever given show or movie that they wanted to, and then they'll churn out to save money. We also know that Gen Z is the most frequent movie-going demographic out there right now, which runs counter to the perception that all they want to do is, TikTok and Snapchat and kind of the, I would say, unfair and outmoded criticisms levied against them by older demographics. So it is really interesting to see a little bit of unexpected trend development in which the older audiences are heavy, engaged, loyal streamers. The younger audiences, as we discussed up top, are congregating around more in real life experiences such as theater going. And I'd like to tack onto that something that's really interesting over the last 12, 18, 24 months is we have seen slowly, smallly, a growing appetite for atypical theatrical product. And what I mean by that is Taylor Swift's concert films,
Mm.
Stranger Things and the Pit finale both doing well, two anime films placing number one at the box office in their release week. Highlighted by Demon Slayer, which made more than 600 million worldwide. Godzilla minus one doing $54 million in America as a non-English film. Now, again, these are all exceptions to the rule, but we are slowly but surely seeing people willing to go to theaters for something that is not a typical Hollywood scripted movie.
Right.
And I think you're going to see that trend continue, and it's driven by young people once again.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of amateur anthropology, but I do wonder how much the role of, what did movies originally do to you? Like in that time in your life when the very experience of movie going hit you in a particular way. I almost feel like that cements your relationship to movies for your life, right? Like whether I mean, I know it still happens with me. And like the first movie that I remember just being blown away by was going to see the Poseidon Adventure. It was the first PG movie I'd ever been brought to. And it was just, it wasn't animated. These were like grown-ups doing grown-up things and, Gene Hackman hanging from a chandelier. And I feel like that almost leaves an indelible footprint somewhere in your psyche around the movie experience. So for me, movies have never been just a disposable experience where I watch it and okay, I forget about it. Like I want to be thinking about that movie hours later, days later. It sounds similar with you, and not to diss any generation, but I do wonder whether things like attention spans come into play. If you're a so-called digital native and your brain has been fed nothing but short form content for a long time, how are you going to sit through a 3.5 hour movie?
Two things to that. I think you're absolutely right that it's not movies aren't disposable content. Every form of fandom, whether it's film and TV, whether it's sports, whether it's politics, is driven by emotional connection and the yearning to be part of a community, a joint, like-minded group of people that is thinking and rowing in the same direction as you or engaging in a discourse that intrigues you. It is completely an emotional thing and it powers purchasing behavior and everything. So film is not just an entertainment medium, it is our ability to process and communicate emotions in visually dazzling manner. And I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
And I think that's always going to be an underlying element that anyone who's selling anything needs to tap into. And then to your second point, I think it's a give and take. It's a pro and con. Gen Z and Gen Alpha are raised on short form content. There's no doubt that their attention spans are less. A lot of studies and surveys show that. But I also think because they are weaned on short form content, it creates that emotional draw, an exciting draw to long form content. They
Mhm.
yearn for something that is different than what they are constantly inundated with. And I think that, again, you can use it to your advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage in other ways.
And that kind of dovetails quite well with the theme of the next article of yours that I wanted to talk about, where you're going into Netflix's decision to really cut back on the number of originally produced movies that they're going to be rolling out. You say that between 2019 and 2023, Netflix released several hundred movies each year. And to be clear, these are Netflix movies. These aren't Netflix has acquired this film that, was produced by Warner Brothers or something and ran in the theaters. These are films that are
Netflix
debuting
original
on
films, yeah,
yes, right.
across English and non-English for those several hundred.
Yes, okay. And in the first 3 months of 2026, the most popular subscription streamer, which is Netflix, has released only 23 original movies, and these are both English and non-English, which
No,
is,
sorry, the 23 is just oh no, sorry, yes, you're right. We can cut that part out. You're absolutely right.
yeah, we're going to keep that in. I was right. Come on. And you say that's an 8-year low for
Yeah.
Netflix.
Shout out to What's on Netflix for identifying that.
Talk to me about the rationale behind that.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
is Netflix seeing that is leading to those decisions?
Scott Stuber, the former head of Netflix original film, was brought on as the studio was moving into original film for the first time. And as the industry interloper, they had to buy their way to validation and to convincing marquee established talent to give them the time of day. And that created this kind of waterfall volume content approach. And on paper, again, you can understand, hey, if we release several original movies every week, we are going to really have a ton of engagement. And what they found over time was that no, that's not the case. So many of these films come and go with just a shrug of indifference from the audience, barely registering in engagement and viewership. So it really created an ROI issue. And then on top of that, once Netflix had really kind of established itself as the most prolific film studio in the world that could more or less work with most of the A-list talent in the industry, it no longer needed that type of volume and no longer made sense to their business model. At the end of the day, the streaming business model is powered more by television, which gives you far longer engagement hours opportunities per subscriber than film does at a much more efficient content spend. So again, financially, it just doesn't make sense to have such a wide volume of original films, and financially, it still doesn't make sense to release blockbuster films with nine figure budgets directly to streaming, even
Yeah,
though Netflix still kind of does that.
you said between 23 and 25, about 25% of the Netflix originals garnered fewer than 100,000 viewership hours.
Yeah, according to their biannual engagement reports,
Yeah.
that is the case, and remember that is some of them are less than that. They cut it off at 100,000 because below that would be even smaller to list.
Ah,
So
interesting.
these are films in 100,000 and less. These are films that are not registering and are clearly not worth the spend.
So just to give folks some idea, and this is a quite personal list because these are the ones I watched. These were Netflix originals from 2025 among many non-English films, I have to say, when I look down the list. But House of Dynamite, Ballad of a Small Player, Frankenstein, Train Dreams, which was nominated for
Yeah.
an Oscar,
Excellent.
as was Frankenstein. I mean, Train Dreams is one of my favorite films of last year.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is not an indictment of Netflix's quality. They do make some good films.
Jay Kelly, which I want those 2 hours of my life back. Thank you. And the third installment in the Knives Out series, The Wake Up Dead Man. So it's interesting. You can totally see the allure from Netflix perspective, from the filmmaker's perspective, as to why this seems like a no-brainer. Like these are going to be massive, massive draws for audiences, but the data isn't showing that.
No, prestige films for Netflix consistently struggle commercially. I believe only Don't Look Up is their only Oscar nominated film. Oh, Don't Look Up and Frankenstein are the two kind of thing best performing Best Picture nominees.
Yep.
And they both did solid. Don't Look Up is in their top 10. Frankenstein isn't. But otherwise, it's tough. It is really tough. The third Knives Out film performs significantly behind the second one. And you have to remember, Netflix paid about $460 million for the rights to make those two films, neither of which are in their top 10 English films of all time, I believe. You got double check me on the second one, but I know the third one isn't. So there's just no possible math that can tell me that ROI is there. Now, Netflix might disagree, and I want to be very clear. Netflix has unbelievably intelligent people. They have constantly throughout their life shown a willingness to adapt, innovate, or go back on something they said they wouldn't do if a business case presented itself. They are damn smart people and a really well-run organization overall. And I think that's reflected by the fact that they are changing their film strategy right now.
Yeah, sure. Do you know if how common or is it mandatory that a lot of these Netflix originals did do short theatrical runs before they went to Netflix? And sometimes that was just to kind of qualify for the Oscars, I think, that they had to play in New York or LA for X number of weeks. But I did look at a rather huge list of 2025 Netflix originals. As I said, many weren't in made in English. I can't imagine they all did theatrical runs.
I can't comment in terms of how many. I do know the ones that I know about are typically the awards hopefuls.
Yeah.
And these are just to qualify them for the Oscars and
Yep.
whatnot. I think, despite the fact that they were on paper committed to theatrical when they were acquiring Warner Brothers,
Yep.
and despite the fact that Ted Sarandos, co-CEO, has kind of walked back some of his anti-theatrical sentiments,
Yep.
it's unfortunate that they aren't pushing forward with more of a theatrical push. I think with the K-pop Demon Hunters re-release 2 months after it came on streaming and was very successful, the Stranger Things finale, which was very successful in theaters, the first Knives Out limited release, was successful, and they have their biggest theatrical push yet later this year in November with Greta Gerwig's Narnia, which will play in, I believe, 1,000 IMAX theaters for up to 4 weeks, something like that, 2 to 4 weeks. You're seeing that when they do make a bet with the right type of content, that's a little bit beefier than these awards runs that mean nothing. They're succeeding, and my hope would be that they take those learnings and try to work them more into their regular strategy moving forward, because every piece of data really proves that theatrical films have better awareness and monetization potential versus streaming exclusive films, and that theatrical films on the whole do better on streaming than streaming exclusive films. So, the I understand wanting to put your subscriber base first, but I think they're leaving value on the table overall.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm wondering what you know about what's the metric around what constitutes, say, a hit. Like, for instance, take a movie like Train Dreams, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of modest in scale. I know it had a relatively modest budget. If you're Netflix, how many viewing hours does that have to hit for Netflix to say, okay, that was money well spent? If it only did a theatrical run, and I don't know what its budget was, well, let's say 25 million, and it makes 65 million box office, then even a movie studio would have to say we made money on that, right?
Yeah.
Beyond marketing and so forth. But what's the calibration for like Netflix? Like in other words, all bets aren't considered equal, right?
Yeah, so I'm pulling up my handy dandy benchmarks
Okay.
notepad, which I have for different data sources. Now, if we're looking at Nielsen, which measures US TV screen viewership, a film debut between 20 million to 30 million plus hours is good to great. A sub 15 million hour debut for a film on Netflix is not great. And top 25 films annually usually are like starting at 50, 55 total hours, 55 million total hours over the course of the run and up. So, like the floor for like a top 50, a top 25 film in a year for US is usually like 55-ish million. Now, for Netflix's own engagement data, I would definitely recommend going to What's on Netflix, which is an amazing resource run by a friend, Casey Moore, who's just brilliant. I am familiar with their global data, but not as much as the US data. But typically, I think Damsel is their most 10th most watched English language film of all time, and I believe it's sitting at 140 million views, and I put that in quotation marks because they do, total viewership divided by running time to figure out views, which is kind of a wonky metric. So
So if I sit down and watch a 2 hour movie, is that two views?
no, so it's still one view. It's like running time divided by total viewership hours. So it's a way to get at estimated completed views,
Sure.
even though behind their, closed doors, they know how many unique accounts,
Yep.
watch something. They just don't give that out publicly, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was I was wondering as I was reading your article, I was thinking, I wonder what would happen, and this would take a lot to fall into place because directors would have to sign off on it, et cetera. But I wonder what would happen if Netflix had permission to almost chapterize some films because so much of the draw of streaming series is that cliffhanger element, or we're going to end this episode with this pivotal scene. You're going to want to hang around to binge the next chapter of the
I think they
series.
did that with the Hateful Eight, didn't they?
You know what? You're right. I think they did do
I think
that
they
with the
did.
Hateful Eight. Yeah.
They should
I,
keep trying.
yeah, it's an
But
interesting.
you're right. It has
Well,
to go
because
through.
people tend to improvise it, right? They just
Yeah.
do it on their own. They'll say, "Okay, this seems like a good place to stop."
Yeah. Why you're right that it requires director approval, but why not experiment?
Absolutely. I mean, particularly you think of something like Killers of the Flower Moon, which I know ran on Apple when that originally was streaming, but come on. That's a 3 night undertaking.
People forget that the one of the benefits of streaming is you are completely and utterly unfettered from schedules or programming limitations and restrictions. You can do whatever you want as a company, with in conjunction with the artists and everything, to try to find new ways to engage people. So why not try if the filmmakers and producers and whatnot sign off?
And coming at that thinking from the other direction, a while back you mentioned about TV being way more successful sort of in the streaming environment. What do you guys know, if anything, around how pivotal is the relationship that viewers have with the medium? In other words, what is the viewer's definition of a TV viewing experience versus a movie theater viewing experience? And what are they going to free up in their lives to engage in either one?
Movie theaters have always, cinema has always kind of been more associated with spectacle, big screen spectacles. It is a director's medium because it's a visual medium, whereas television has always been considered a writer's medium. And I think this dates back to, the inception of TV all through the kind of late night wars. And even today, television is a more intimate medium because you are inviting these characters, these
Yes.
figures into your bedroom and your couches, on a nightly, weekly basis. There is something more, I think, connective on an everyday level than film, which is more eventized. And so that perception really does play into the commercial value sell.
Yeah.
I think a lot of straight to streaming films feel like straight to streaming films. They don't feel special and eventized and unique and willing and good enough to break the gravitational pull of your couch. Whereas, you hear, hey, Christopher Nolan's making a new movie. You're like, that's going to be an experience. I got to
So
go
true.
see that 70 millimeter IMAX Dolby, pay for a premium ticket because that's going to blow my cat back.
Yeah, exactly. Well, when I was growing up, you're probably a little young for this, but ABC, NBC, I don't know if CBS did it, but there used to be this category, the movie of the week.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
wasn't a TV show. It wasn't a theatrical movie. It was a made for television movie. And it had its own vibe. I mean, I'm not sure if the numbers still hold, but once upon a time, the most watched television event in history was a movie of the week called The Day After, about the day after a nuclear event. And it feels to me like that might be the Goldilocks just right solution for, say, the Netflix of the world. Like let's keep our ambitions in check, but it's there theoretically could still be a home for movie makers, film directors that are okay with, I don't know what the word would be, whether it's more humble ambition
Yeah.
or a smaller budget or a smaller rollout.
The most of the streamers we've seen have right-sized the budgets of their straight to streaming films. There are
Okay.
no longer outside of mostly Netflix, these massive blockbusters being released directly on SVOD. And it's to your exact point. And analyst entertainment strategy guy who's brilliant has brought this point up a lot. The Disney Channel on cable in its heyday would produce a Disney Channel original movie every month that absolutely shaped and drove my millennial generation's childhood. I mean, I could reel off a dozen names of Disney Channel original movies that I loved back in the day that are still kind of memed and talked about today. Why has Disney Plus seemingly lost the ability to do that? Why isn't there a monthly release at an extremely reasonable budget that shapes the next generation of children's, regularly occurring entertainment, consumption appetites? It is odd that they don't. Now, there are some straight to Disney Plus movies, I believe the Descendants franchise, the Zombies franchise, that have done well, but not nearly at the same regular cadence and consistency as the Disney Channel original movies from my childhood. So one would think we would be trying to revert back to those old ways while splitting the difference between premium programming and, affordable, right-sized content ambitions, like you said.
In the aggregate, are Netflix's viewing hours year over year, is it continuing to grow, or is it hitting that plateau that you mentioned with the younger audiences perhaps moving away?
So Netflix is dealing with an attention ceiling, and this is something I wrote for a different outlet, Hub Intel, and their overall annual viewership hours are up from 2023 to 2024 to 2025. But as they grow more subscribers and as competition gets stiffer across the streaming landscape, their average viewership per subscriber is declining in that same time. So your average Netflix viewer is watching less last year compared to the year prior, compared to the year prior. So that is a difficult trajectory that they're trying to break with different strategies. It'll be very interesting to see how those strategies play out as they try to reverse that trend to make sure they're squeezing the maximum amount of value per subscriber.
Yeah. Well, in keeping with that topic of, eyeballs staring at a screen, the last article of yours I want to talk about was the one opening weekend is breaking Hollywood's movies before they can
Oh yeah.
breathe. So there's a real, essentially the gist of your article, which just came out on the 29th of April, was that there is such an emphasis on opening weekend performance that many movies that may eventually, one day perhaps, find an audience, they don't even get the chance because they either underperform or they just. I've listened to other podcasts where on the Thursday before the Friday open, essentially the movie's condemned because somebody had
Yep.
forecast
Yep.
what the opening was going to be.
Thursday night previews reported Friday morning
Yeah.
are setting the discourse for the entire weekend, and it is dangerous.
So today is May 1st when you and I are speaking, and The Devil Wears Prada 2 seems to me to be the big release of the week. When will we know? You and I are speaking midday on Friday, May 1st. Will we know by 5 p.m. tomorrow whether that's going to be quote unquote a box office hit or not?
We definitely should. I know from my company's tracking and projections, this is going to be a hit. It's going
Yeah.
to be a success. Barring something very unforeseen, this is going to be a healthy box office win. But you're absolutely right that the opening weekend hyperfixation of Hollywood not only sets the table for premature discourse, but it actively influences the behavior of consumers and suppresses the access to certain films. And that
Sure.
is creating an environment that's designed to fail.
Yeah. Yeah, so talk, one of the things I found really interesting in that article was the relationship between the theater owners, as often referred to as the exhibitors,
Yeah.
and essentially them taking the temperature on a film's performance during opening weekend. And is that because that determines how long or not they will commit to show the film in their facilities?
I think the real struggle when we're talking about opening weekends and the relationship that exhibitors have to certain films is concentrated in smaller films. Now, big budget blockbusters have their own can of worms, which we can hit on. But I think what's really immediately tough is that a smaller distributor with a film that's not necessarily opening wide on 2,000 plus screens,
Okay.
it's opening smaller,
So
and it's
that
trying.
that's what is being referenced when we hear the term limited release.
Exactly. Yes. And so these distributors and these production companies will be trying to convince theaters to show their film.
Yeah.
And very often, the argument from theater owners, exhibitors is let's see how it performs in its opening weekend. And if it does well, we'll add it to our, showings.
Yeah.
But that creates a self-fulfilling loop of failure because
Yeah.
when it doesn't have enough screens, the audiences that might be interested in seeing it don't have access to it anywhere near them, which leads to a poor opening weekend, which leads to the exhibitors turning around for weekend two and being like, well, it's not doing well. Why would we show it? And now suddenly you have cut the box office run of this movie at the knees before it's ever had a chance to really grow. And it's unfortunate that we live in this what have you done for me lately immediate gratification financial model
Sure.
because it is actively suppressing film financial potential. And, it's exacerbated by national tracking services that can't get into regional tastes. We might know, for example, we do know that slasher horror does really, really well in urban markets with diverse populations because Black and Hispanic audiences are the most consistent horror moviegoers in the country. So when, let's just say, your $5 million low budget indie horror film is only playing in areas that don't necessarily service those audiences, you're trying to run a race with one leg tied. I don't know if that, do you tie one leg? I actually don't know what that means. You know what the analogy I'm going for is.
It's difficult.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for clarifying my ranting nonsense.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting conundrum because, as you just said, there was a time, and maybe this still exists, anecdotally, where a quote unquote smaller movie based on word of mouth you would see the uptick, screen to screen, week to week, and then perhaps it would even expand. And going back even further, there used to be these theaters where they would be running the movie that had been out for maybe the movie's already been out 8 or 10 weeks,
Yeah.
but you knew you could go to that theater, see it on the big screen because 2 weeks later it was going to be on video on demand or something like that. It feels like those don't exist anymore.
It's really tough. And I believe, and fact check me on this, I believe America lost 1,000
Yeah.
theaters or screens post-COVID,
Yes.
something like that, which means the mom and pop shops that are more likely to take a chance on all these kind of outside the mainstream studio system films are gone.
Sure.
And multiplexes are running on such thin margins that they almost can't afford to not show Avengers Doomsday in every single theater for every single screening. So we really have created this model that is just built to fail, that is built to hurt certain movies, and it's really difficult to break out of that.
Yeah, when you mention the thin margins, I think folks often are under the misperception that, if I'm the theater owner and I have a blockbuster, playing, that doesn't in that film made $90 million over a weekend, that theater owner really is just making most of his money on concessions still.
Correct.
Yeah, and so that is why, from a theater owner's perspective, they're taking a big gamble. And why should they take the gamble if the studio won't take the gamble?
Historically speaking, US theaters split 50% of ticket revenue with studios. And in some cases in which the studio has massive leverage, infamously, like Disney with The Last Jedi, the studio kept 65%
Yeah.
of ticket revenue. And so, yes, you are making most of your money on concessions. And it's just becomes this really difficult financial equation because understandably, exhibitors are trying to protect against their downside. Instead of playing to the hypothetical long-term financial upside a film could make, they'd rather go with something that promises more week-to-week stability. And so it's difficult to like the Terrifier trilogy.
I have only heard of it. It's not my
Yeah.
genre.
And so these are micro budget horror films that have grown into phenomenons, but the fact that they have reached the point where it's three movies and they keep outperforming their budgets and relative to expectations by enormous degrees is a miracle because they had to fight and scratch and claw to get a critical mass of theaters to even accept the first film over time and had to be given that kind of platform runway where it could build word of mouth over weeks and weeks and weeks. And so I always also think of something like Upgrade, a Lee Winnell directed action film from God, it's 2019, I can't exactly remember, but in the last 10 years. And that was a film that did okay in theaters, but didn't have a really long run because it wasn't making enough money. So it's lost its theater count and then blew up on VOD.
Okay.
Absolutely, people discovered it there. And like, that's great that there are these continued home entertainment options that allow for somewhat second lives of film, but they aren't as lucrative as VHS and DVD, which could massively support an entire industry and provided one of the best safety nets in the history of Hollywood that allowed theaters to have the financial runway to gamble on kind of more artsy, more creative, less commercially guaranteed fare. And so when all of this becomes this compressed, contracted industry in which making money is hard because staying in theaters is hard because discovering your film at home isn't as lucrative, it just creates a race to the middle creatively, financially, and it's disappointing for audiences.
Yeah, it's kind of a case of short-termism, where it's certainly not unique to the movie business. You
Yeah.
you see this a lot in corporate America, where everybody is loath to look past the next quarter in terms of what constitutes success or failure. But give us a sense of what happens when a movie that perhaps it had a big budget, a big investment had been made in marketing and in production, but it really underperforms in that first weekend. How quickly are adjustments made in terms of its rollout and any type of carry-on support around advertising and so forth?
I mean, we see blockbusters flop all the time. That's unfortunately this post-COVID, we're seeing more volatility where people think something is safe and the bottom drops out and they can't really explain why. Although long lead tracking, like what we do at Greenlight Analytics, can identify well in advance, hey, this is a red flag. We're an early warning system and we're telling you this something is off here, and we can help you identify the disconnect and ideally correct it. But so often you will see a film open to 3,000, 4,000 plus screens absolutely bomb if it's a blockbuster and start immediately losing a couple hundred screens every single weekend from there on out because there we know that there's not going to be a ton of legs
And
historically.
that's the studio's decision to pull it from those theaters?
Theaters will sometimes stop showing. Studios can absolutely decide if they want to move up the transition to at-home entertainment via
Okay.
VOD,
Yep.
PVOD, or streaming. So it's a bit of a dance, but theaters can say like, "Hey, we have this other title that we think is going to do better than this movie that's bombing, so you're out of here." Although there are contracts and there's a lot of minutia in there. Someone else can kind of speak to the granular details better than I can. Historically speaking, once a film sinks under $2.5 million in a weekend. That's usually in the past when a studio would send something to at home, VHS, DVD, now VOD. Things have changed a little bit in this era because everything's so complicated, but that rule is still a general accepted guideline.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me what role, if any, word of mouth, being positive or negative, or even film reviews are playing in terms of impacting uh, opening weekend success. Most recently, I'm thinking of the Michael, which made $90 million on its opening weekend, got horrible reviews, but that didn't seem to dissuade moviegoers.
No, in this fragmented ecosystem and social media, landscape where you can build an echo chamber and you can get opinions and coverage from thousands of sources, the critics' role in box office is pretty much non-existent these
Okay.
days, and that's fine. I don't think it's ever, as a former critic, I don't think it's ever been the critical community's job to tell you whether this movie is commercially viable, whether it should make money or not. It's about giving you an idea of the film's quality, themes, our artistic merit. So I kind of think in some ways it's a good thing that it isn't as influenced, but then you do see these divides such as Michael, and it becomes an incredibly toxic conversation online in which the audience for some reason thinks critics are trying to bomb a movie intentionally or have some sort of agenda, which could not be further from the truth. I've been accused as a former critic of being a shill, being paid by Disney to give good reviews. Which, hey, if they want to give me millions of dollars, you'll see my Instagram will be me on a golden jet ski drinking cocktails, and that never happened.
With Mickey Mouse ears.
Exactly. That never happened. Or that they have an agenda to sink a film, which is just the most ridiculous, idiotic 21st century BS that I've ever seen.
Well,
And
I mean
so,
that also assumes that you're dealing with people that can separate just sort of opinion from a critical sort of analysis of a film.
yeah, people think, hey, I didn't like this movie. And they hear it in their head as you are dumb for liking this movie. When that's
Right.
not remotely what's being said. All nuance is lost when it comes to a 240 character tweet.
Yeah, so true. Well, as I said, we're talking on May 1, and I think that this sort of unofficially starts the summer movie season.
Yes, sir.
What
Exciting
do you,
times.
what, a couple of things. What are you sort of maybe, I'm not going to say predicting, but what do you feel confident about as an analyst in
Yeah.
terms of summer movies that are going to be rolling out? And what are you looking forward to seeing as a movie fan?
Because we're not live, let me bring up some notes I actually have on this
Bring them on up.
quickly.
I just went, before we were talking, I went through a whole list of summer releases, and I just have to say, I can't wait to see Toy Story 5.
Oh yeah.
We're really glad original thinking is winning out.
Well, to that point, I will say the elite tier of summer movies that are already tracking like massive blockbusters include, The Devil Wears Prada 2, Spider-Man Brand New Day, Toy Story 5. You've got a strong tier like The Mandalorian and Grogu, Mutiny, Supergirl, Insidious, Minions and Monsters, Scary Movie 6. Backrooms for A24 looks like a potential breakout and a continuation of that boutique studio's commercial success because they've really have pivoted in the last 2, 3 years to more an A24 idea of mainstream commercial viability, and
Yeah.
they're doing well. They looks like they're going to do that. Young Washington also has breakout potential. Then I think in the mid tier, as of right now, you've got things like Coyote vs. Acme, Death of Robin Hood, Disclosure Day, which I'm excited for as a Spielberg fanatic, but has
Yes.
surprisingly low awareness after 2 trailers. And then, you've got a weaker tier. And what we're seeing is not totally unsurprising as of right now. A lot of
Is the Christopher Nolan film out this summer, or is that going
yeah,
to be in the
sorry, the
winter?
Odyssey as well is looking
Okay.
really, really strong. Completely
Yep.
forgot about that. And what we're seeing is a lot of the IP-driven tentpoles are pulling healthy early numbers, and a lot of the original titles and smaller scale sequels or new to screen films are showing early signs of struggles. And both of those trends align with what we've seen in recent years. Now, having said all that, a lot of these films aren't coming out for weeks or months as of May 1st. So anything can happen and so much can change. But as of right now, that is a loose early picture of what the summer is looking like.
All right. Well, we'll have to talk again in the fall to see to see exactly what
How
turned
right
out to
and how
be.
wrong I was.
Yeah, to be the major hits. And, I'm looking forward to the three or four in there that sounded appealing to me. I'll probably end up just seeing the Odyssey like three times.
Exactly. So every summer, me and my brother plan a brother's trip because he lives in a different state, and we build it around one or two movies we really want to see together. So this year it's The Odyssey and Supergirl.
Oh, I love it. That's awesome. That's awesome. Brandon Katz, I really enjoy these conversations, and I feel like they could go on for so long because you come at it, as I said before, with this left brain, right brain meld of movies, you love movies, but you're able to talk about them in a way that makes the numbers sort of the underpinning of whether audiences are going to get out there to be able to discover them.
Can I hire you as my professional cheerleader, Michael? Can you
There you
write my
go.
LinkedIn bio? This is
My rates are somewhat reasonable.
listen. I'll do it because my ego is just blowing out of proportions right now. Thank you.
So let's assume I'm not the only one who's interested in the great work that you do. Tell folks where they can find the rest of your work.
You can follow me at great_Catsby on Twitter. I publish articles at greenlightanalytics.com, observer.com, Hub Intel, and TV Rev. And they're always just fun, data-driven musings and rantings. I like to put a lot of stupid jokes and a lot of data into my writing. So if you're into that, go check it out.
Well, you bring the numbers to life, that's for sure. Enjoy that double feature tonight.
Thank you, sir. Yes, appreciate the idea.
All right, Brandon, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Michael.
A young man from a small town with a very large imagination lay alone in his room with his radio on, looking for another station. And when the static from the mouthpiece gave way to the sound below, James Dean went out to Hollywood and put his picture in a picture show. James Dean went out to Hollywood and put his picture in a picture show. And it's, oh, daddy, get off of your knees. Mama, why'd you have to go? Your darling Jim is out on a limb. I put my picture in a picture show. Oh, oh, my picture in a picture show. Hamburgers, cheeseburgers, Wilbur and Orville Wright, John Garfield in the afternoon, Montgomery Clift at night. And when the static hit the mouthpiece, it gave way to the sound below. James Dean went out to Hollywood and put his picture in a picture show. And it's, oh, daddy, get off of your knees. Mama, why'd you have to go? Your darling Jim is out on a limb. Put my picture in a picture show. Whoa, whoa, my picture in a picture show.